You remember back in 2018, the IPCC in October came with this report about 1.5 degrees and what it would require of us if we were to keep global warming at the level of 1.5 degrees globally. They said directly that it's going to require rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. And this was something like a bit of a shock, because until then, the IPCC, as being, the authority on climate at a global level, the experts had never been saying things as boldly as that. So this went around in the media at the time, and little did we know that it was actually going to happen a lot faster than we thought, wasn't it? We have just experienced rapid and far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of our society, but not the way we thought, not because of climate change, but because of a virus. It's like nature saying, go to your room. And in a way, what we talk about is that we have not been sent to a room, but to the tunnel. When we communicate, everyone now in Zoom and with Skype and the digital world, it's almost as if we have come back, and I say come back to the tunnel, because back in 1940, there was another big crisis starting. The Second World War was just kicking off. Hitler was bombing London to scare people, hoping that they would surrender very quickly because of the fear he was trying to spread among the people. So they took refuge down in the subways, in the train tunnels. The surprising thing was that, and you can almost sense it when you look at the picture here, that people didn't get scared as such. They got together. Historians are telling us that when people came out of the tunnels, they actually said that they, because of that togetherness, that sensation of unity that they have felt down there when talking and meeting with other people and so on, they came out of the tunnels even more determined than ever that they were going to win this war. So it's in that spirit that I talk about that we are back in the tunnel. We do a little radio show every week called the Sustainable Hour. Because of the pandemic, it's now a podcast and not a radio show, because the radio station has been closed down. But we continue every week with our podcast. We've done more than 300 hours by now. And what we talk about in the tunnel, as we call it, is how we're going to deal with this, we think, or we anticipate, even bigger crisis that's waiting around the corner. A little bit about me. I come from this place up on the other, complete opposite side of the planet, born in 1962. So I'm 57 years old by now. I'm the dad to 3 kids. Back in 2016 in February, the graph of how the temperature is rising actually was peaking above the 1.5 degrees. And we were a group of climate activists at the time who looked at that graph, and we were thinking, why is this not headline news? Here we've been talking about, the IPCC has been talking about the 1.5 degree, and now we're seeing the graph already above it, and nobody's talking about it. What is going on? So we started talking about that this graph in itself ought to take that graph and turn it into a logo of some sort, and turn that into what we would be talking about. And so we did that, and we talked about what the campaign should be, how we should run it. And we were inspired by what had happened during the Second World War. First of all, by the simple fact that when you start a war, it's actually, it's a matter of words. It's a matter of that a state leader or a government tells the people that there's a threat here, there's somebody coming attacking us, and we need to take action. So what do? They declare war. So you can declare a war. So we were thinking, well, maybe you can also declare other things. We were inspired by Winston Churchill, and he's been saying a lot of things to mobilize people, because people at the time were actually not thinking that they should go to war against Hitler. That was Churchill's idea. One thing he said that we turned into our slogan for our campaign as well was that it's not good enough to say, oh, we're doing all we can and we're doing our best. You've got to succeed in doing what's necessary. And when that comes to the climate, what's necessary is we have to stop polluting the air and get the temperature, stabilize it, get it at a safe level at no higher than 1.5 degrees globally, which means that we actually have to start drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. So I sat down and made a website called climateemergencydeclaration.org. I turned, as you can see at the left, the graph into a little logo. And then we kicked off with this campaign. This was in May 2016, where the first thing we did was that we wanted to get rid of this talk about climate change and turn it into that we talked about climate emergency. We wanted to use the word emergency when we talked about the climate. And that was actually not a new idea at all. Already 10 years before, we've heard the UN Secretary General talk about that climate change is an emergency. And there was a book that David Spratt and Philip Sutton wrote in 2008, which was giving the case for emergency action, as it says in the subtitle on the cover there of the book. Philip was one of the 4 people who were starting this campaign about running a petition where we were calling for government to declare a climate emergency. And this was something that Philip had been thinking about for years. He had even written a long, 20-page long example of what such a declaration could look like. So we turned it into a campaign to say that to declare is something you can do. You can declare a climate emergency. This was the first ad that we put in the Aidt in June 2016. And we got 24 distinguished Australians to put their names up so that we could show that this was not just 4 climate activists talking. This was something that we had Tim Flannery and scientists, various people behind us. Even Bill McKibben had signed this letter that we put in the Aidt at the time. Then we started collecting signatures. And it turned out to be a big job, because people weren't just jumping onto this. A lot of climate activists were telling us directly that, no, you cannot talk about emergency. It's just going to make people depressed and spread anxiety. We can't talk about the emergency. We have to talk positive. So it took us a full year of hard work, mainly with the website, but also on paper, to collect 18,000 signatures, which we would then hand over to Parliament about a year later. In Durban, there was a city council election back in November 2016. And we went around to the councillors or the candidates for running for council and asked them if they would sign our petition. As you can see here are 3 of the candidates who happily signed our petition. And when this council was elected, it turned out, we looked at the signatures we had, and we found out that 7 of the 9 people who got into this council had signed our petition. So we told them. Trent, who you see on the right here, was bold enough at their first meeting when the new council met. He looked around in the room and said, 7 of us have already signed this declaration or this climate emergency petition. And why don't we as a council, therefore, declare a climate emergency? And people were like, but what does that mean? Well, it means that we begin to take, we lift council's responsibility up to a level where we say, well, this is an emergency, we acknowledge that, and therefore we have to act accordingly. Number 1, we have to have a climate emergency plan. So that happened, and that made history, because Durban became the first city council in the world to declare a climate emergency. We went into the next year, and soon after, Yarra City Council followed. But then there was a long, quiet period. We have to go all the way to December that same year before, over in America, there was a council that declared a climate emergency, the 3rd council in the world. That's because Philip Sutton had been talking with some climate activists in America and talked to them about this idea. This was just when Trump had come into power in America, and the Americans were pretty depressed at the time. The climate activists were very depressed at the time about that. And Philip suggested to them what had happened. He told them what had happened here in Melbourne, that there was a council that had declared a climate emergency, and therefore we could start a movement of councils declaring, and in that way sort of create that push from bottom up, from citizens to councils, and then from councils upwards towards the federal level. Something happened then in 2018 that became significant for the movement. One thing was that up in the UK, there was a group rising up, they were called, who were beginning to hold meetings in April, May 2018, where they asked people, are you willing to get arrested? We're going to launch something big. It's going to be called Extinction Rebellion. In October, we'll come out thousands of people in the streets, and we will be willing to be arrested. So already after holding around 60 meetings, there were 300 people who said, yep, we're with you. We're willing, we'll go as far as to get arrested for the climate. And what was significant for us was that they had been inspired by this talk about the climate emergency and that you can declare a climate emergency. And they turned that into their first demand. They had 3 demands as a movement. And demand number 1 was that governments must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency. So this was something that really spread the word in the UK, that this is something you can do. Over in Sweden, Greta Thunberg, 15-year-old girl who is now world famous, sat out alone in front of the parliament and started the school strike movement as we know it today. But that was in the beginning just Greta herself. And she was from the start talking about, first she talked about a climate crisis, but it didn't take long before she also began to talk about that we are in an emergency. And she came to London, and the 2 movements, the youth movement that Greta was a representative for, or a front figure for, and then the Extinction Rebellion movement sort of came together in October at the big launch in London, and where Greta was saying that rebellion will begin unless parliaments will declare a climate emergency. So the pressure was on. And young kids, 14-year-old, 15-year-old teenagers would go into councils and start talking to the councillors and saying, you have to declare a climate emergency. And surprisingly, the councillors were listening. You can see YouTube videos of councillors in tears when the youth talks about climate. It's like it becomes a different story because it becomes an intergenerational responsibility story. And councillors suddenly took a new approach to this. So especially in the UK, things started to move, and lots of councils began to declare a climate emergency. So that's what happened in 2019 in a way, was that these 3 different movements in a way started pushing for the same thing. We had Greta with her school strikes, we had Extinction Rebellion with the civil disobedience movement, and then we had the declaration for a climate emergency that has started here in Melbourne, gone over to the America, and now had become a global movement. This is the graph that shows how many councils had declared a climate emergency. You can see in 2017 at the left, Durban declares. A whole year later, Montgomery in the US declares. Not much else happening at the time. But then, if you see the blue or the purple graph, the UK suddenly exploded and went over up to 300 councils in the first half of 2019. What we didn't know in the English-speaking part of the world was that in the French-speaking part of Canada, the whole thing has taken off much sooner. There was a campaign that was started in the middle of 2018 in the French-speaking part of Canada, and they had already 300 councils that had signed in the beginning of 2019. I made this mock-up, as it's called, this dream, this visualization of what it would look like when we won. What would the Sydney Morning Herald look like the day that we would wake up one morning and we would see a declaration of a climate emergency? This was just to give people, when we did the petition, the idea of the dream in a way, where we were heading, what we wanted. stated in a visual way. And my God, I could hardly get my arms down when it almost turned reality. And seeing SBS News in April 2019 having this headline, the UK becomes first parliament to declare a climate emergency, was that exciting. So the dream, in a way, came true. It's been on the front of our Facebook page right since 2016, and it's still sitting there today, actually. This mock-up of the paper there. So things started to move very quickly, and today there's more than 450 councils. There's almost 90% of the population that's covered. They live in a council that has declared in a climate emergency up in the UK, and the EU has declared a climate emergency. That was a big day. Over in Canada, now it's 500 councils that have declared. In America, it's coming close to 100. Here in Australia, we're also approaching 100 councils. New Zealand doesn't sound like much, 16 councils, but New Zealand isn't that big. It's actually covering 76% of the population who live in these 16 councils that have declared a climate emergency in New Zealand. And even in Asia now, especially with Japan coming in, with 25 councils having declared over in Japan, and Bangladesh as a nation has declared a climate emergency. Yet, not to say that it's just been without criticism. Again and again and again, in councils, there's been these discussions, and you've experienced that in Shepparton just as well, just a couple of weeks ago when councils was discussing it there, that, well, we don't need a declaration. We can take action. We don't need a declaration. There's this whole idea, especially from the liberal part of politics, where they're saying, oh, this is a Greens conspiracy. It's just a way to get Greens policy into council and so on. So it certainly caused a lot of discussion, but in a way, I have always said that's good. That's exactly why we started this. That's what a petition is for. It's to create that discussion. And there's been some very concrete action. When we look at all these declarations, and there's more than 1,500, not more, there's like 1,490 councils by now that have declared a climate emergency. So almost 1,500 councils worldwide. And when you look at the different proclamations and resolutions and declarations and motions that these councils have made, because each of them have made their own, and they're all different, because there's no fixed rule, there's no standard way to declare a climate emergency. That's up to each council how they want to do it and what they see fit to do in their community. But the general trend is that a lot of cities, and I would say the majority of them, have set a goal of getting to net zero emissions for the entire community by 2030, so in 10 years' time. That seems to be a standard. Some say 2035, some say 40, but not very many of them say 2050, because that's almost like, if you say 2050, then it's like you're not taking the emergency serious. The thing about councils is that the councils, when they only look at their own operations, that's only representing maybe 1% of emissions in a council. So the obvious thing is that they have to get the community with them, and they have to also start pushing for that the national government begins to listen to what more and more an increasing amount of councils are saying. So that's the strategy, you could say, behind this. That it's not enough that council just takes care and puts solar panels up for its own swimming pools and the city hall. It's also about getting the community on board. So it's about creating that new discussion with the community about what we need to do and how we will do it. And this has been the strength of this movement, is that it's been bringing the community together. You've been seeing business people and councillors and activists come together in the same room and beginning to talk about how to make a plan. A mayor said that this is like when you say it's an emergency, you roll up your sleeves and you get to work. And in each of, or not each, but in many of these councils, the result of having declared a climate emergency is that within the next 3 to 6 months, they come up with a plan. So how are we going to respond to the fact that we have now realized that we are in an emergency? So there's been a huge mobilization because of this. And what a moment we had in the end of 2019 when Oxford Dictionaries declared that climate emergency was to be the word of 2019. We were suddenly writing history at a global level. And we have seen the movement spread into that we're now seeing businesses saying, well, we can declare a climate emergency just as well and let our employees know that we have done that. So you're seeing executive boards and CEOs contacting me, for instance, to hear about how you do it. And in the UK, there's even been a playbook written by B-Lab about how to declare a climate emergency when you are a business. So in the UK by now, 30 businesses have declared a climate emergency. We pushed our radio station, The Pulse, where we do our radio show, to declare a climate emergency, which they did last year. And more different professional groups are calling for that their national bodies will declare a climate emergency. And they also declare a climate emergency at a private level. So we have the architects, the engineers, and the psychologists, they have declared a climate emergency. There's a petition you can sign where you declare a climate emergency for yourself, and then you call on the union or on the national body to also declare a climate emergency. Journalists have done it lately, musicians and so on. I'm waiting for the day when the unions begin to get on board, and that's even beginning to happen. And also an exciting moment was when a law school declared a climate emergency. The schools are coming on board, universities are coming on board. I'm thinking when these young lawyers become lawyers, it's going to be an interesting world how they're going to take the climate emergency into how they think and how they work. A petition was run at the federal government's website where more than 400,000 Australians signed this petition. So that means that it's going to be discussed in Parliament later this year. Now we have a corona crisis and that I think has pushed everything. But it's going to happen that this petition means that the politicians will be discussing whether to declare a climate emergency in Parliament here in 2020. But maybe the biggest moment of all was when the scientists stepped out of their laboratories. And they don't like to do that. They don't want to be seen as trying to talk politics. But they did that when they declared a global climate emergency. 11,000 scientists signed a petition that had been running for some time and came out and said, this is a global climate emergency. Wow, it couldn't get much bigger than that. And then suddenly, end of last year, it began to happen in a way. What we had been talking about for years, that climate change is an emergency, even if you can't see it, it's an emergency. It actually became an emergency in the unprecedented way that Australia was burning, with fires at a level that has never been seen before in this country. At the same time, numbers ticking in that climate change is not something in the future. It's happening, folks. 70 million people were displaced last year because of extreme weather events, cyclones, droughts, and so on. 70 million people already affected by climate change. So that's reality. And there was a poll that was done before the bushfires really kicked in November last year, where average Australians were asked, do you think we are in a climate emergency? And the surprising answer was that more than, I think, 68% of the population said, yes, we think it's a climate emergency and we want our government to start mobilizing, to take action on climate change, just as if we was fighting a war. I'd like to hear from you where you would position yourself on this scale. Where on the left we have people who actually don't think climate change is a thing. President Trump has said it many times, he thinks it's a Chinese hoax or something. Where in the middle we have politicians who say, yeah, we acknowledge there is something, we acknowledge the science, but we have a lot of coal in the ground and we can't just stop the coal industry. So we have to do a bit of both. We'll put up a bit of wind turbines, but we'll keep digging up coal as well because we're making billions of export dollars on that. And then we have the group that I have been belonging to saying it's a climate emergency. And then at the very right, we have people like Professor Jem Bendell from the UK, who says, sorry, but we are in a collapse. It's already too late to do anything. And we may as well just get ready and adapt to what's coming. Just a quick poll here in our group of, how many are we? 5, 6. Where would you position yourself, you think? Just say the number.
4.
Somewhere between 4 and 5.
4. Yep.
4. All right. So this is a group. So I'm talking to like-minded here. I can say that I think generally before the bushfires, the population would, if you ask the entire Australian population, most people would probably say that they're somewhere in the middle. And this group here would belong to the 4%, 5% of the population who says it's a climate emergency. But that all changed with the bushfires. And I would say that today we're probably more like here. But that's just a guess. I don't have the stats behind this, but it's something like that. I would like to talk a little about what next, because the bushfire certainly has shown us something about climate change that has changed the discussion completely. And I think with the pandemic we're now experiencing, that's even going up another notch. So if we're talking about this decade that we're entering,